Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Y'all can do better than that. Good afternoon, everyone. We're so delighted to have the students and participants of the Queens EOC be here with us this afternoon. I haven't had a chance to come over and be with you this year, so I'm delighted that you're able to be with us this afternoon for this Black History Month lecture. And for our York College students who are very thin today, but that's how it goes sometimes, we're also welcoming you as well. My name is Dr. Ron Daniels. I am a distinguished lecturer here at York College, and I teach in the Department of Health and, I'm in behavioral sciences. And among other things, I wanted to point out that we have some of our colleagues here. We thank our colleagues who have come to be with us. We also want to give a shout out to the Men's Center. Some of their folk are here because one of my assignments is to work with the Men's Center here at York College. Jonathan Quash is the director of the Men's Center and will be coming in and out, but he has his staff here to help with the program today. We also just want to point out that we have internships here at York College. One of my assignments is to manage the internship program, in which we place people with elected officials and community agencies. That's Political Science 393 and 394, so anybody who's interested in that. We just have 3 students who are now going to be going this weekend to Albany for the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Caucus, where President Keyes will be there as well. And some of these actually pay. So they've got a stipend of $2,000 and they get a chance to work with elected officials. It's good on your resume, so we're touting that as a very important program. We also, great. We also just want to bring your attention to a piece of literature on your chair. I'm also the president of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century. And on this coming Monday, which is President's Day, so you'll be off, so you can come and be with us at the Mother AME Zion Church in Harlem as we commemorate the life and legacy of El Haj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X. There's a new book that we have out on Malcolm's life and legacy. You see that on this piece of literature. We also want to bring your attention to the website, ibw21.org. If you go to that website, you'll see the many engagements that I'm involved in outside of York College, but it's also why I'm at York College, because I have extensive experience working on issues of importance related to civil rights, human rights, throughout the country and sometimes throughout the world. Today, we wanted to spend a minute. We hope that you will be attentive and also be ready to ask questions and engage on a topic that I thought was important for Black History Month. And that topic is entitled, Can We All Get Along? Can we all get along? The role of Black history and multicultural studies in creating a more perfect union. Now, many of you won't recall this because you were too young to recall it, but some of my contemporaries out there will recall the famous words that came out of the mouth of Rodney King, who was brutally beaten in Los Angeles, and an entire rebellion was sparked because of that. And he famously is someone who was not a college-educated person. He wasn't a civil rights activist, but he did express the concern in an interview. He said, just can we all get along? And that became one of the things that was very notable about Rodney King. So in our course in racial and ethnic politics, Political Science 214, we use a book which is entitled, Can We All Get Along? And it's about the whole question of racial and ethnic minorities here in these United States of America. Black History Month, I want to begin with that just because we'll have one-on-one. Black History Month is something that was conceived by a notable historian called Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson. And Carter G. Woodson conceived the Black History Month because he felt that people of African descent in this country were not being portrayed well in books, that people of African descent themselves had no real sense of their own history. So Carter G. Woodson's first mission was to make sure that people of African descent who had been enslaved in this country and had gone through some very horrific experiences would have a sense of their own history. In fact, he said that those who do not know their history, he who controls the mind controls the body. And so he was saying, in a sense, that if you don't have a sense of your own history, then you are subject to be controlled by other people. So a part of his effort was to begin to have black people, first and foremost, understand their own history. However, black history is not just for black people. And that's one of the reasons why we want to have this discussion today. Though its first purpose is to help black people free their minds, the reality is that if there is no understanding of the history, not only of black people, but others, as we'll say, it will be difficult to deal with the proposition that we hear coming out of the mouth of President Barack Obama. He often talks about a more perfect union. And indeed, the concept of a more perfect union is enshrined in the sacred documents of the United States of America. And because you are the people who will determine the destiny of these United States of America, not only is it important for you to understand the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, it is really important that you understand what I would call the real unvarnished history of these United States of America. And you cannot really do that without understanding particularly the history of people of color. Malcolm X, who was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, and next week there will be commemorations of that all across the country. Malcolm X once said that of all of our studies, history is most qualified to reward all research. Malcolm was very anxious to have black people study our history. Now, one of the things that I point out, I use the term unvarnished history, because what we often get is a kind of glorified, sanitized version of American history. So it's George Washington, it's Honest Abe, it's somebody who chopped down the cherry tree, and it's all good stuff, but in some ways it's not unvarnished. By that I mean it doesn't get at the real stuff of what history is all about. And essentially, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this talk today about black history and multicultural history or diversity has to do with the fact that when we look around this room, we look at York College, you see a tremendous mixture of people who come from all over the world, because we have a changing America. The question is, though, will we all get along? Not only will we all get along, will we be able to help shape a more perfect union? Now, I say that because, in my estimation, this is still a work in progress. We do not have that perfect union yet. We have huge issues, which some of you are dealing with in your own lives. You're trying to get an education as a way to get a job. Well, right now, jobs are very scarce. Right now, there are serious complexities in terms of who gets a job in America and who doesn't get a job in America. You happen to be in the city of New York, and you're a black man around the age of 30, or a Latino man. Black men in the city of New York are 50% unemployed. When you count those who've given up, 40% of Latino men have no jobs, and that's in the city of New York. So we do not yet have this more perfect union. So the question becomes, having you understand history not just as some idle exercise, but that history has meaning, because when you study history, which is what Malcolm was saying, then you have a sense of what really happened as a basis of understanding why conditions are where they are today and what prescriptions we can use to change it in the future. Now I'm going to be quoting out of this book a little bit, so just bear with me, because this one quote in a way helps to set the stage for what my concerns are. So just bear with me just 1 second here. And this book is entitled, Can We All Get Along? Racial and Ethnic Minorities in American Politics. It's by Paula McLean and Joseph Stewart. Very provocative quote here. North Carolina has the fastest growing Latino population in the nation. Latinos, by and large, are entirely a new population in the South, for the most part. And they have no experience with immigrant populations of Latin origin, that is to say, other people in the South. These Latino immigrants have no sense of the Southern history and the legacies of slavery and segregation on the social and political environment of the region. For the most part, they also hold negative stereotypes and views towards blacks, with Latino males holding more stereotypical views of blacks than Latino females. Latino immigrants do indeed feel that they have more in common with whites than with blacks. Moreover, living in the same neighborhoods as blacks appears to reinforce the view on the part of Latino immigrants that they have more in common with whites and less in common with blacks. As Latino immigrants continue at such high rates, this might suggest that Southern blacks will not only have to be concerned with racism and its consequences among whites, but also among new Latino immigrants as well. Can we all get along? A part of what I'm saying here, the reason why I wanted to have this discussion today is there's no reason why Latinos and blacks ought to be in contradiction with each other. But if we do not understand each other's history, then these tensions are potentially a problem or can occur. So I want to begin really and run through some things with you today in terms of how I approach it, even in my classroom. Because I think for those of us who are people of color in particular, we have to understand the evolution and development of America so that we know where we're situated and the nature of what the challenges are in terms of creating this more perfect union. And the first one is two propositions I start with in my class of racial and ethnic politics. One of them, and people get excited and they get nervous when I say this, two propositions. One is that everybody should understand, and this is not one of the problems with how American history is taught, is that it's like glorified, it's sanctified, it's sanitized. One proposition is that from the very beginning, this democracy in the United States of America, and I'm sure you won't see this among the Tea Party, you won't see this on Fox News, it was conceived of as a democracy for the few. This great union, which is in potential, and I choose my words carefully, from the beginning was seen as just for the few. It was not a democracy that was envisioned for Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and the sort of the masses of the people. It was for a limited number of people. Second proposition is that this democracy was really conceived of as, this country was conceived of as being a white man's land. Oh, that's right. And I challenge my students to not just do this rhetorical, but to deal with it in terms of documented evidence. That while we are trying now in this 21st century to perfect this American Union, we have to understand from the beginning that that was not the intent at the beginning. It was intended to be a white man's land. And I don't say that to be inflammatory, I say that because it's fact and I'm getting ready to back it up. So these two propositions. The first one we can deal with very quickly. The signers of the Declaration of Independence did not have largely Native Americans in mind, because we all know that this land belongs to the Native Americans, right? We are here because of the dispossession of Native Americans. This is their land. And we could go through a long discussion about how that happened and why it happened and the clashes of culture and worldview that brought it about. But the real tragedy is, at the end of the day, a people who were, the many peoples, because they were not just one, who were the peoples, the indigenous native citizens of this land, of this country, residents of, and occupiers of this country, no longer did so after this great nation was created. So Native Americans were not in the Constitution of the United States. We also know that from the beginning, those who could participate did not include women. Women were not a part of the proposition. We know that the enslaved Africans were not a part of the population. But guess what? Not all white people were included either. Not even all white men were included. Because until 1828, the era of President Andrew Jackson, the voting in this country, and voting is considered to be the critical measure, only white men with property, were allowed to vote in the elections of this country. And voting is supposed to be the fundamental pillar of democracy. And so my point is, it was from the beginning, democracy for the few. That has changed only because people have fought to change it. It didn't just miraculously happen one day that somebody woke up and said, oh, we think that women ought to vote. Or we think that Native Americans ought to vote. Or we think, this required intensive protest and a sense on the part of people that they were being excluded. They fought to change that. So to the degree that we have now that part has been cleared up, it is because there were social movements by people, and we know the long struggle that women fought to get the 19th Amendment. It took decades for women to be considered worthy to vote in these United States of America. And even today, we don't have an equal rights amendment, and we still have a gap, a glass ceiling, with a disparity between the wages and the incomes of men versus women. So that means that we don't have yet a more perfect union in that regard. Now, the more provocative proposition. We say that America was conceived as a white man's land. And so from the very beginning, I want to just give you a quote or two just to quickly supply the evidence of this proposition. Following the ratification of the Constitution, Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1790 in response to the Constitution granting congressional power to pass a uniform rule to deal with the process by which foreigners would be admitted, quote, to be admitted to rights of citizenship. This act granted citizenship as a matter of right to free white aliens who had lived in the United States and had shown good behavior for 2 years, who expressed an intention to remain in the United States and took an oath of allegiance. Check this. Between 1790 and 1854, the Congress of the United States passed 15 laws concerning naturalization and retained the phrase free white person. Let me go over that again. Between 1790 and 1854, the Congress of the United States passed 15 laws concerning naturalization, that is to say, who could become a citizen, and retained the phrase free white person. What's my point? My point is that from the beginning, it was not conceived of as a land for everybody. And indeed, those of you who want to just go back and check this out, and some of you already know this, people of African descent were enshrined in the Constitution of the United States as 3/5 of a human being for the purposes of counting for taxation and for voting purposes, particularly in order to keep the South on board. Blacks were counted, but counted as 3/5 of a human. It's the so-called 3/5 compromise. Again, the notion, democracy, the nation as a white man's land. Now let me just quickly go over a couple of other things. This didn't just apply to black people. It applied to Mexicans. In 1848, the United States, there was a war, Mexican-American War. Quiet as it's kept, one of the things that people don't sort of often understand is that California, Arizona, New Mexico, all of those territories once belonged to Mexico. And the United States, in its expansion and its desire to take on new territory, war broke out, they seized this territory. In seizing this territory, they promised Mexicans that if they chose to, they could stay here and they could be granted citizenship. But as soon as the ink was dry on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they violated the treaty. They were not granted rights as citizens in the United States of America. Their rights were stepped on. Now, just parenthetically, when we start talking about these immigration questions and so forth, you know, people get a little uptight about the Mexicans coming across the border. You know, that piece of history is important to kind of understand. You know, what happened in 1848 in terms of the Mexican-American War. I mean, you know, some people might just consider themselves crossing, coming back home, because this territory originally belonged to Mexico. So in your understanding of what's required to build this more perfect union, at least we ought to have some empathy and some interest in terms of what happened in history in relationship to this population. Doesn't mean that we don't have issues to settle in that regard, but at least we ought to have some clarity about that. Chinese, the same thing. Chinese were brought to this country to do work on the railroads and various other things, and this is not unusual. I mean, Africans were brought here so they could work, and they were useful as long as they could work. Chinese, so they could work, right? But there was always this notion, again, at the end of the day, that America was a white man's land. And so, 1882, you have something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Let me just give you a quick little taste of that. It says, even if they had wanted to, Chinese could not become citizens, for they had been rendered ineligible for citizenship by the 1790 law that reserved citizenship for white persons. The exclusion barred most Chinese from citizenship, but the interpretation of who was white was left to the administrative officials. But the operative term again is, who is white? You gotta be white, right? Thus, a small number of Chinese in the black community we called it passant blanc. They were allowed to pass for white, okay? But check this out. But the anti-Chinese immigration antipathy and nativist sentiments were so strong that President Rutherford B. Hayes said the following. He warned Americans about, quote, the Chinese problem, saying that the present Chinese invasion should be discouraged. Our experience in dealing with the weaker races, the Negroes and the Indians, is not encouraging. I would consider with favor any suitable measure to discourage Chinese from coming to our shores. And so they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to limit the number of Chinese who could come to the United States of America. Same thing with the Japanese. They needed the Japanese to do some work. Then they got nervous because there were too many Japanese, and so they applied similar laws to try to constrain the number of Japanese who could come and participate in the country, using, again, the same provisions that they were not white. Now, again, I stress this because, you know, we got a little hysteria going on now, and I'll come to that in a minute about this whole issue about, you know, maybe there's getting to be too many brown people in the United States, right? But this is not a new phenomenon. And so, again, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the California Land Act of 1913 is another, the Immigration Quota Act of 1924, and then a decision dealing with Native Americans called Elk versus Wilkins, which basically said that Native Americans too could not, in their own land, could not be citizens because they were not white. And it just says that. I mean, this is not like, you know, this ain't Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture getting up like ranting. This is what the documents actually say. So understanding these propositions, the only reason I go through this is because if we are to forge a more perfect union, again, we have to have this kind of unvarnished history. And particularly, we must have more focus on Native Americans and African Americans, because these are the cases in some ways which are the most egregious. I've already talked about Native Americans in the sense that, again, this is their land. It was land that was taken away from them. The series and series and series of broken treaties where time and time again they were told and promised things that they would in fact be given land and they would be treated well, only to find it betrayed time and time and time again. Most often in the interest of profit. But the other egregious thing is that there was a major effort also to make the Indians assimilate. They actually moved Native Americans from the reservations. They put them in boarding schools so they could make them white, red people. Because by and large, what we have in America for many, many years, the dominant culture was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. That is to say, almost everybody, even European immigrants who were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, had to, in fact, in some ways accommodate themselves to being white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in terms of the cultural milieu. Italians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans, and so forth. But these Indians, the notion is if you are to be accepted, you must adopt to the ways of the white man. And so they went through all kinds of things to dress them up and paint them up. And if you understand the nature of culture, culture is the stuff that make a people stick. When you tamper with their culture, the people come unstuck. And so one of the great tragedies of Native people is that they've had to go back and try to reclaim their culture. And even today, you go to the reservations and you see alcoholism, you see domestic violence, you see all of the lingering effects of a people who have been culturally damaged, but who are striving still to try to refine themselves. That is a part of the story that we have to understand. So in some measure, even though Native Americans were granted sovereignty, they do have sovereignty, and now there are, they have casinos and various other things. There is still this tragic legacy of the damage done to Native people. Then when we come to the issue of African Americans, or Africans in America, Malcolm X also had another great statement. He said that we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. You all know about Plymouth Rock. He said Plymouth Rock landed on us. In other words, he was pointing out that unlike the other immigrants who came to this country, and this is an important point, we did not come voluntarily. It was an involuntary migration. It was being captured and brought here against our will. And the story, to be fully fleshed out, done in a way that really was very damaging, again, to our culture. Because we were forbidden to speak our own languages, forbidden to speak, to practice our own religions, to play our own music, to even gather together as particular ethnic groups for fear that we might rebel against the slave-owning system, if you will. And so in many respects, when Malcolm said Plymouth Rock landed on us, it landed on us in a very, very devastating way. Only in the United States of America do you have a scenario where people, human beings, were reduced to property. Nowhere else did you have slaves, enslaved Africans, reduced to property. In the United States, you had chattel law, reduced to property, just like, as Malcolm would say, a horse, a cow, a chicken. We were reduced to that level in terms of the law. And what it meant was the need to try to build a new community inside these United States of America, which is still a problem. Because again, culture is the stuff that makes the people stick. If you take a group like the Italians, for example, or the Irish, or whatever group that came, it is not that they did not have problems, but they brought their language intact. They brought their religion intact. They brought their music. We were even forbidden from playing our own musical instruments. All these things came intact. So that therefore when they came with what was called cultural continuity. They could cohere as a group. And even today, if you go in various cities, you see these enclaves of people by ethnicity because they have cultural continuity. People of Africa, and by the way, they could be more accepting because within the context of a racialized society, they were white. Who knew which one was Irish from Italian, from Greek, from whatever? They were all white. There was no mistaking African people because our skin color defined us. And so against those odds, we had to try to create a new African community. Had to start not all over because we did retain our Africanism, but we had to try to build a group of people inside of that. That's a very important. It's called cultural aggression. The attack is called cultural aggression, one of the most overlooked phenomena within the discussion about people of African descent in this country. And I don't have time really to get into another interesting piece of it. It also has to do with the fact that you have a black people in a society dominated by white images and white culture. So much so that everything white in Eurocentric culture is positive. I mean, it's like, we're black in a society where even the English language is attacking us. So it's behind the eight ball, it's the black sheep in the family, it's the black lie is kind of really, really negative, but a little white lie is kind of not so bad. And it gets ridiculous as angels food cake and devil's food cake, right? So you're growing up with the psycho-cultural damages of the English language and the images of almost everything white is good. The angels are white, God is white. You know, you go to the movies, it's the clash between white and black. And if it's negative, it's a dark day in history. A black sin is certainly, I mean, you know, that's really serious. You got a black sin. And those of you back in the day when we used to pay the dozens, now this generation doesn't do that. You know, if you could be talking about somebody's mama, so forth and so on, but when you said your black mammy, oh my God, I mean, that was like getting decked. Because that was just not, I mean, so black was that negative. This is why in the 60s and 70s, and we've had to go through these Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, and then the 60s and 70s, a black consciousness movement to get black people to affirm that to be black is okay, that to be African is okay. Because within the context of this society, we were taught, we came to believe that to be black and to be African was negative. This is what Carter G. Woodson in part was dealing with in terms of creating Black History Month. And so, the devastating impact of cultural aggression. And then the whole process of enslavement itself, which eventually was done away with in terms of the so-called Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't really emancipate everybody. I don't have time to go through all that. But the point I do want to make is that when you look at this long journey of people of African descent in this country, and again, my reference point is that as we have more and more people coming to these shores, even African people from Africa and Caribbeans, they sometimes are not clear about the same things that the Latinos are not clear about. They don't have a notion of what this so-called African-American civil rights history is all about. And if we are all to get along, and if we are to build this more perfect union, then we need that to be incorporated into our educational process. That's the theme I'm driving towards. And so you have a group of people, emancipated, so-called, by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which really didn't do it all. It took the 13th Amendment to actually deal with that. Because if you were in a state that was not in active belligerency against the Union, you were still a slave with the Emancipation Proclamation. Because Abraham Lincoln's first objective was not necessarily to free the slaves, it was, in fact, to keep the Union together. And he saw an opportunity, frankly, you know, because we were liberating ourselves, we were actually beginning to leave the plantations. He saw it as a stroke to get black people to leave the plantation, striking an economic crippling blow, and also to join the army. So a huge number of black people actually took up arms to fight with the Union Army. But it was not until the 13th Amendment that slavery was actually abolished. So you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You had the Civil Rights Acts of 1868 and 1875. And one of the reasons I say that is because you had a period called Reconstruction. In this period called Reconstruction, we had more black people. We had the right to vote in 1865. We had the right to vote. We elected more black people to elective office than at any other time than the present. But something happened, something changed. And a part of that change was that, well, underneath that, let me just say this. And this is why some of you may have seen that documentary the other night, Slavery by Another Name. And if not, go back and pick that up. I didn't get a chance to see it, but I already know the story. Because what that is saying is, what that documentary points out is, even if we were, quote, emancipated, here you have a group of people who are enslaved, whose free labor, and I don't have time to go into that today, their free labor helped to build the economic power of the United States of America. I mean, it's a nice little economy. If you get people to work for you for free for a couple hundred years, I mean, you could kind of make out with that, right? So their free labor helps to build it, but they are freed without a state. So here you have political rights without what's called social rights. There was a discussion of giving 40 acres and a mule. In fact, there was even a bill before the Congress of the United States that would have provided reparations, 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman had a field order which would have granted that. So with that 40 acres and a mule, at least you could have got a good start. But the reality was something different. For the vast majority of these formerly enslaved Africans, they went right back to the same plantations. They were sharecroppers. They were tenant farmers. They were agricultural laborers, if you will. And the vast majority of what that meant in effort, if you were a sharecropper, it meant that you had a piece of land, you shared the land, you produced the crops, and in exchange for you having a place to stay, you raised the crops, and you got your farm implements, and then at the end of the year, if there was a balance, you were supposed to get the money. But there was never a balance. You were always in a situation where you always owed massa for your keep. A situation of new slavery, slavery by another name. And what that documentary points out is this lasted well into the 1940s, in the 20th century. So even after the Emancipation Proclamation, even after the so-called end of slavery, there was a period in which this new form of peonage was there. And by the way, interestingly enough, what it points out is, today, while we have this huge mass incarceration, large numbers of black people and Latinos, but particularly black people in prison, this is not a new phenomenon either. Because what they did was they created laws, stop and frisk, or, they created laws, vagrancy laws. So if you were just hanging out, didn't have nothing, that was against the law. You could be therefore locked up, put in prison, and when they put in prison, what they did was then they would hire you out as convict labor to work on same plantations. You were hired out. And today you have a similar thing, because we have prison labor now also emerging. Point I want to make is, that was all, so you had social rights without political rights. We had people who were governors, we had people who were lieutenant governors, Congress people, legislators, people in all these capacities. But there was nothing underneath it in terms of an economic foundation. And even the political aspect of it was overturned in 1877, 1876, when the Republicans, who had been radical and had been in our favor and whatnot, had helped to move us forward. And I can't completely sketch that all out. Suffice it to say that we were betrayed in 1876, and the federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and we were left to the mercy of those who were angry at us, hostile towards us, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, all of these violent white supremacist organizations that drove us away from the ballot box. And then you had such things as the literacy test, the poll taxes, and all kinds of things that disenfranchised black people. Now it's interesting, in a week or so, on March the 4th in Selma, Alabama, national leaders are now getting ready to march from Selma to Montgomery again on the same issue. All across this country, legislators passing different laws that they don't say that's the case. They talk about fraud, but the reality is there's been no study illustrating fraud. We know that what these laws are about primarily are to suppress the black vote, or the votes of poor people all over again. Fast forward, the point I want to make is, so we had a civil rights movement. We had a civil rights movement that had to fight to regain all of those things that had already been won, that we already were doing between the period of 1866 and 1876. Black people had black power in that period, but it was turned back. And so all of the things that we did in the 60s and 70s, including my being able to have the privilege of being in Washington, D.C. in 1963 when Martin Luther King delivered the speech on the March on Washington. I happened to have been there as a young brother many, many years ago. I didn't have an afro right then, but I certainly didn't have a hole in it. I had some hair in those days. Watching Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, and those deliver those powerful speeches on that day. All of that was a struggle to regain that which had already been won, but had been lost in this period within the context of the framework of white supremacy in these United States of America. The final sort of conclusion to what I want to point out is this, that this civil rights movement, or this broader human rights movement, because it went from civil rights then to a whole notion of black power, and a whole notion of black people having a sense of strong identity and a sense of purpose and a sense of direction. That's where Kwanzaa came from, by the way, out of the brains of Dr. Maulana Karenga. But this struggle not only inspired black people. When black people said black power, our Latino brothers got up and said what? And sisters said what? Brown power. Native Americans said what? Red power. Chinese began to talk about yellow power. We had the Black Panthers. The older folks created something called the Gray Panthers. This movement of black people, therefore, helped to eradicate in the 20th century the legal barriers to open housing, to employment, to all of these things, putting at least on the books the notion of equal opportunity for all. Now, it hasn't been achieved. But my point is that if we're at your college, of course we have diversity classes here and that's good, but my broader point is if we are in this country and we have people who want to get along and we don't understand that history, we got a problem. Because at the end of the day, the proposition I also put on the table is if this country is really going to be in a position to achieve a genuine, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society with equity, and equity is important because we don't want a society where we have a 1% and a 99%, I don't think. That's not what Martin Luther King was marching for at the time that he was killed in Memphis. He was really fighting against the idea that there was a 1%. He was saying that all human beings who live in this country, irrespective of race, ought to have a certain basic quality of life. You should have a right to a decent job, a right or a guaranteed income. You should have a right to a quality education. You should have a right to health care. He was fighting for that basic thing, saying that this is a part of the struggle for a more perfect union. It cannot be a union where we have a few people who exploit the many. It cannot be one where there is, again, the 1% and the 99%. And this, in some ways, has been a part of the history of this country. Because the only reason why we have people who now have unions, and unions are shrinking in this country. And one of the problems there is, again, we have people in this country who don't understand, who have no sense of labor history, no sense of the fact that the quality of life for people in this country has been significantly enhanced because people were fought to organize and maintain unions. Because left to their own devices, the robber barons, if you go through history, you hear the robber barons, the captains of industry and so forth. Their objective was to maximize profits by minimizing cost. And in that regard, whether it was child labor, unsafe labor, whatever it was, they maximized profits. And so it's interesting, someone like Rick Santorum, who's running for president of the United States as a conservative, and he talks about his background and whatever, and I just wonder whether his father was a member of a union. I suspect if we look back, we'll find out that, you got to where you were because there were unions fighting against these entrenched 1% interests. So much so that many of them were also gunned down at the gates of Pittsburgh or at the Haymarket in Chicago, Illinois, where people were gunned down. Other white people killing other white people, by the way. Because at one level, it has nothing to do with race. It has to do with a society where there's some who are more interested in property and profit than they are, in fact, the question of human rights. In fact, the question of equality of life for all human beings in this society. And so this quest for a more perfect union, which is yet unfulfilled, because in my vision of this more perfect union, we have to go back and address the issue of Native Americans. They have to be made whole. They are not yet whole. They are still suffering. They still have the lingering effects of the devastating dispossession of their land and the effort and the violation of treaty after treaty, the trail of tears where they were forced from Florida to go to Oklahoma. Thousands, hundreds of people dying along the way. That has to be addressed. I mean, we need to have comprehensive immigration reform for lots of reasons, not the least of which is we owe it to our Mexican brothers and sisters and all in the Latino community to have an equitable way of dealing with immigration, which also should include a foreign policy which helps to develop develop nations as opposed to exploiting nations. So that maybe people won't leave and come to this country because their own countries are thriving and developing. You know, you don't see a whole lot of Chinese running over here these days, except for limited purposes. Why? Because the Chinese economy is what? It may not be exactly what I want it to be, but it is it's developing, right? And so that becomes an important thing that we address. Also, the issues of Chinese, and also the issue, again, of African Americans in terms of the effort really to finally heal these wounds that have been there for so many years. And so the conclusion is this. And, you know, I work with continental Africans. We have a thing called a PanAfrican Unity Dialogue, and we're having to have a discussion because, again, it's not, we have continental Africans who come and they say, what's up with these African Americans? How come, what's going on with all these conditions? We're here. Well, you're here because you don't have to ride at the back of the bus. That fight was fought. You don't have to worry about which lunch counter you can go to, or you can access hotels. And to the degree that you have these rights and privileges, because there was a civil rights movement, and that applies to other groups who now have access in a way that you would not have had it not been for the civil rights movement that was fought. So the conclusion is, therefore, we need to therefore have not only African American history, but multicultural studies that is unvarnished, that tells the truth to the people about what happened in history. So that becomes a basis, therefore, not of us being in conflict with each other, but working together around issues that are common in terms of uplifting the vast majority of people who do, in fact, quest for a quality of life in this society. And I think that was the vision of Martin Luther King. I think that's what he wanted to achieve, was this whole notion that we could, in fact, live together. But it's not just some kind of touchy-feely proposition. It has to do with real issues, real understanding of history, and a real commitment that, in fact, if we have this understanding, we can create a more perfect union. Thank you. So, we're ready to take some questions. Yes, sir.
You know, one of the only word I can find, one of the most dangerous things about this is that you try to cover so much over such a broad period of time in so short a period of time. Now, when you're talking about, there's no question and it depends on what section of which one of the 13 colonies you're talking about. Now, if you're up in New England, okay, yes, the issue was whites, but it was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If you're in the South, the issue was the people who came here came to create economic enterprises for the sponsoring people that came here. Now, yes, they were white, but they were a particular type of white. They were white who were not the money class, but the prison class who came. So that created another dynamic. The part
But that's why we talked about it being democracy for the few, because it was for the people who had property. The revolution, when you look at the people sitting around that table, you don't see Davy Crockett, metaphorically, and you don't see Daniel Boone.
It's dangerous because you try to cover so much in so short a period of time of such a complex topic. And yes, you do it to wake people up. No question about it. I'm not saying it's bad. Don't tell you that.
No, I'm not.
And even when you're talking about the Native Americans, there were thousands of different Native American, we call them tribes, but they were nations centuries before any European came here. And the only reason that the Europeans, when I say Europeans, I'm not just talking about English or Spanish or Portuguese, the only reason they could survive is because these people, Native Americans, had cultivated the land. They were not these nomads. These were people who had agrarian societies just like we do, who fought wars just like we do, to suppress other people just like this country did. But the difference was, as you had said, there had never been a form of slavery like that in this country. Slavery has existed since people were on the earth. If I beat you, you do what it is that I tell you. But you can become like me. Your position was not predicated on law, on religion, on everything. No country's ever had to deal with this United States. Then now when you're talking about the Constitution, Ben Franklin got the idea of the Constitution from attending a meeting of the Iroquois Nation where women could vote and women could be the head of organizations, be the head of the tribe. So there's just so much there, and for people to understand, look, for every point of view, remember, there's at least 2 others. So when you read one book, you remember, you want to read the opposite book. If your teacher gives you one book, you want to read another point of view, because the truth is somewhere in between. So there's no such
Sometimes it is, sometimes, not always. But anyway, it's a fair point. Well, not necessarily. But
I
we.
won't take one anymore. I mean, I'll take another time.
But your point is right. I mean, we could spend here. You know, I've covered in 45 minutes a broad swath of territory that obviously you couldn't. You know, but we take all of your points as being good points. Yes.
Hi everyone. I have one simple question. I hear about number one. Sorry for my English. I'm in the English class, so I have one question, a curious question, because I hear a lot in this country talking about the 1%. Okay, my question is simple, Dr. Daniels. When or how long the 1% in this country going to get along with our multicultural?
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Well, one of the points I was trying to make is this: that there is a fear among some, and you find this particularly on the right wing. And even though they say it's not stated, there have been, the Pew Research Center has done studies, particularly on the Tea Party, that shows an antipathy or an anxiety about blacks and people of color. Underneath some of this so-called conservatism is a fear of the loss of, quote unquote, our cherished American way of life. Translation, as I started earlier, I mean that this was a nation which was conceived as a white Christian nation. And there's fear that this white Christian nation is being lost by the influx of these people of color. And of course, there's the threat, quote unquote, of, you know, lesbian and gay people, that they're trying to change, again, our cherished American way of life, et cetera, and so forth. Now, the issue of when will it change is very much the source or the purpose of the conversation. It will change when we change it. In other words, when I start with the notion of can we all get along, and if we're in the situation where we have Latinos in North Carolina who really would rather identify with whites than blacks, or who really somehow are buying into these myths and stereotypes because they don't have the history, they don't have the multicultural diversity studies that enriches their understanding of what happened, then they come in and they just see some lazy, shiftless, we're making it, we're doing well, and so we've got to overcome that. Otherwise, what will happen is we will end up in conflict with each other while the 1% continues to, in fact, do what it, not only that, it will recruit some of us to be on the side of the 1%. It's like Malcolm X said, right? The house Negro and the field Negro. You'll have a whole group of people who'll be saying, what's the matter, boss? We sick? I mean, there are people who should be. And even in this election, you see this is one of the great tragedies of American history. You find working class white people, who are identifying with policies that really are against their interest. It defies Marxian material analysis in some ways. That on cultural issues, on social, and underneath some of that is also a kind of racial subtext, in my opinion. So the way to overcome that, it seems to me, is precisely a place like your college, where we have so many, this rich diversity. And when I'm in the classroom very often, we have to stop because there are points that we're talking about that people who are newly arrived, they don't have any sense of what we're talking about. And yet we have to prepare them to participate in this society. So they will not be fully able to do that unless, it seems to me, there is an appreciation. And I singled out black history because of the unique role of Africans in America. But it's not just that. That's why I went through the whole issue of, how the Chinese were treated, how Mexicans were treated, how Japanese were treated. I mean, because the hysteria that we're seeing now is not a new hysteria. There was a hysteria about the Japanese and the Chinese. There was even a hysteria about the Greeks and the Italians, because from the perspectives of those who were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, these Southern Italians who were Catholics and these Europeans who were coming from the Eastern Europe, they were a little suspect. But eventually, again, I'm saying one of the things that makes it easier to assimilate if you have white skin, it makes it a little bit easier. we have a problem because there's not enough Natanola bleaching creams. Y'all don't know about Natanola bleaching cream. There ain't enough Natanola bleaching cream to make me white enough to be Poisson Blanc. So, but the short answer is, it's through social movements that you actually create change. Yes?
Dr. Dennis, what advice do you have for young people who are, they haven't started their careers yet, or many are coming to college because they want to get a good job, and you think they can reference that there aren't that many jobs anymore. What advice do you have for young people, given the complexity of the world today?
Well, I think two things. First of all, one of the reasons why President Obama has placed such a heavy emphasis on community colleges is because there's also a major mismatch in terms of job availability and skills. There may be 500,000, there may even be 1 million jobs in the U.S. economy right now waiting for people who do not have the skills to match up with those jobs. And this is the other thing that I find somewhat infuriating, to be honest about it. And I'm not opposed to anybody in this regard, but here you have a policy, an immigration policy, that quote unquote will admit, quote, skilled and expert people from other countries. And India is often singled out. Now here you have a situation where India, which still has its slumdog millionaire scenario because it's got vast poverty as well, but at least it's invested enough that it has an educated middle class that has a surplus. So they're coming in. And I'm not against them, that's not the point I'm making. But here we have in the city of New York 50% unemployment among blacks and Latinos, men, and this society has not invested enough resources to upgrade their skills. Now what kind of dynamic does that set up, by the way, when we have people coming in who, again, they don't have this history we just talked about. You got young black Latino men and young African American men who can't get those jobs, but who may be looked down on because they don't have the skills, because there's not so I'm saying that has to be dealt with and corrected. So, well, today I think some of the skills that are very important are pretty fundamental. Number one, anything dealing with computers and computer skills, computer programming, computer technology, I mean, that should be automatic. It ain't what I'm good at, quite frankly, but I know that that's the way that you've got to go. The health industry is wide open. I think here at your college we have substantial nursing program. You're not going to be wanting for a job if you're in the health industry, for example. But there are also more and more. I mean, there was a time when we had vocational education in this country. That's kind of gotten poo-pooed on. So machinists, and there are those kind of refined skills that are out there. I don't know. I can't name them all, but I'm sure you could look up and see where they're bringing in people to take those jobs because we have not trained people in this country to take those particular jobs. The other thing I would say is this, is that you cannot simply be passive. You can't be passive. There's a relationship between your action and the outcome in terms of whether you have a job and don't have a job. There has not been an urban policy in this country for a long time. There's been significant disinvestment in terms of programs that we used to talk about in our time, the CEDAR program, the Joint Partnership and Training Act, that no longer exists. So we need to be active. And by the way, the other area obviously that's wide open that you see being projected is energy and green economy. I mean, these are areas that you really need to be, and even if, I want everybody to get a college education. A college education is important not so much just because of the occupational part of it, it's because of the ability to understand the society you live in and the ability to think. There was some, Brzezinski was on television the other day, and he was talking about the complexities of the situation with Iran. And frankly, what he said was, it's a challenge for the United States to engage in a constructive way because the population, he basically said this, it doesn't understand. He basically said they're not sufficiently uneducated to understand anything other than Romney getting up and saying, nuke them. That's not what he's saying, but I mean, it's some bellicosity. I mean, because people are not, we've been in situations, so the educational component is so that you can be a free thinking, and the gentleman here is absolutely right. that you want to be in a situation where you are hearing all points of view. So in our classes, I know in my classes, we invite that. We actually get people in adversarial positions so that they can tease out all sides, because that's the reason why you need a quality education. So but in addition to that, having a vocation is not a dirty word. Having an ability to, to do mechanical things, to do vocational things, to be a machinist, and this is the area where it seems to be the economy is moving in terms of getting not just, some really, really good jobs, but it means you're gonna have to be willing to retool, you gotta be willing to get in there, and if necessary, change your vocation in order to match that which is important in the economy. But the other point I was trying to make is this: you have to be engaged. You have to fight for the policies. You have an election right now between two different visions. One vision is saying, yes, let's cut the deficit back over time, but right now, let's not cut off our nose to spite our face. We have got to, if we're going to be competitive with China, you're going to be competitive with India. And by the way, we live in a world today, that's why multicultural studies is also important, it's a new world. I know I'm not allowed to say this, Fox News would jump all over me, because I'm not a believer in American exceptionalism. This country no longer can stand up as the super ego, control the world. It cannot. When the president met yesterday with the vice president of China, he's meeting almost with his equal. And the Chinese can have a tremendous amount of U.S. debt. We're dependent on China. India is an emerging power. That's not to be a bad thing, that's a good thing. And so the notion of multilateralism as opposed to unilateralism, figuring out how do we all get along on the international plane, means you also have to understand the culture, the history, the background of other peoples.